Personally, I think I have always loved tales of terror. Ghost stories have always interested me. I like creepy things, what can I say? One of my earliest favorite books was a look and find book filled with monsters, ghosts, and aliens. One of a collection of 3. On the front, Dracula, a werewolf, and a mummy. The other books bearing good old Frankenstein's monster, and goblins, and witches, and ghosts. I fucking love this stuff. I'm not alone, of course. The fact that there are so many subgenres within horror fiction and film attests to the popularity of being scared or creeped out. Everything from crime thrillers with mild suspense to torture porn, such as the Saw films with graphic, gory death scenes and blood-curdling screams of pain. All of that, and everything in between, stems from the desire to be scared. And I think we both love that shit, right?
Oh, being frightened is so fun. I mean, it's the goosebumps up and down your neck. Just, there's no better feeling, man.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. Ain't that right?
I swear.
Hold on. Nicholas?
Call me whatever you want. I don't care.
Alright, whatever you want. So, anyways, we're here at the People's History of Horror podcast, and his name is actually Mike, and I know this.
And this is Eric?
This is Aaron.
Oh, close enough.
Yeah, well. So, this is not a Salem's Lot episode. That'll be coming up next on our list of episodes. Anyway, so this episode's more of a just to kind of get to know us, and we'll be discussing stuff like that reading that I just did from my blog.
You should check it out if you haven't checked it out yet. What's it called again?
It's a Strange Creation literary blog. You can find that at aarongeary.wordpress.com. So I guess the main thing that I wanted to talk to you about here is whether or not we're having fun with this and why we're doing this. And so, Mike, are you having fun?
Yeah, I'm having fun. I love going back and reading. Man, I haven't read this story in years, and I'm excited to read some of the stories I haven't read yet. And I don't know, man. It's like something to look forward to.
Yeah, and I mean, anyone who's kept up with me knows that I love this stuff. And so, one of the things, since this is mostly a horror podcast, it's even in the name. Obviously, in future episodes, we'll be discussing people like Lovecraft, and probably Clive Barker will come up, and there's names that we could just keep going and going and going, and I actually kind of do in some places on my blog. But, for example, Edgar Allan Poe. A lot of people called him the father or the grandfather of horror. And that's because he really did kind of take the detective novel and push it in a specific direction. He had a lot of the gothic elements going on. But as far as someone like King being the master of horror, a lot of those elements come from people like Lovecraft or Tolkien. And we were kind of discussing that earlier today about how
it's funny because Tolkien, people don't think of him when you think of horror, but most modern, at least, horror writers, good ones, great ones, most of them are heavily inspired by Tolkien.
I mean, who wasn't terrified by the whole Shelob's Lair incident?
Oh, man, giant spiders? No, thank you.
And so, speaking of Tolkien in this instance, and obviously when you talk of Tolkien, you're mainly talking about Lord of the Rings, or at least the Middle-earth mythos. And since our reading list does tend to revolve around Stephen King's The Dark Tower series, that is one of the main elements that, is involved in that. And I just wanted to read this quick little bit. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. And so began the Gunslinger. I finished it in less than 24 hours, which is not that big a deal, as it is quite a small book. But I started in the morning and read until the middle of the night, stopping only to eat and use the bathroom. I had school the next day, so I slept, but rather poorly. I had to know what happened next with Roland Deschain of Gilead. I read all the next day at school. I devoured the words like a hungry dog finding a steak after a week of no food. I'll start with this. I described it as a fantasy epic. This is not entirely accurate. I simply used that term because it was what King wished to write, as he so loved Tolkien's epic and wanted to not emulate it, but write his own epic in the spirit of Tolkien. However, the list of genres that you could attribute to the Dark Tower series is quite a bit longer than just one. Fantasy? Yes. Science fiction? Yes. Western? Indeed. Mystery? Sure. Romance? Yep. Anything else? Well, you could also add horror, of course, among other varied subgenres. A dash of steampunk here, a dollop of comic book superhero shit there. Personally, I think it quite amazing and a great feat of writing to successfully combine that many different genres into one story, and seemingly with ease. Of course, just listing basic genre names hardly captures the essence of it. I could, of course, break it down even more and talk about specific tropes that King took from those genres, or even how certain tropes are overlapped to create a new trope. But I suppose this hinting at it that I'm doing is just as effective in making my point. I could also give a list of specific inspirations, like Lord of the Rings, Arthurian legends, T.S. Eliot and Robert Browning poetry, and the good, the bad, and the ugly. What King does with his entire bibliography still to this day is quite fascinating and, in and of itself, amazing. So, I can't personally think of another series or singular book that really combines that many different kinds of story into one big epic.
No, none come to mind. It's the only series I know of that is literally every genre.
Yeah, at
or
some
at least
point,
everyone I care about.
Yeah, at some point, I mean, you hear all about some military tactics here and there. There's politics sprinkled in. You learn about like 5 or 6 completely separate cultures and, their background.
Different time periods?
Different time periods, different versions of the same time periods. And so...
And multiple callbacks and visits to other places from his universe.
Yeah, and so that's what I was going to say. Like, as we go forward, just keep in mind that there's really 3 books, and I did kind of lay that out in this as well, and I would just go ahead and read that. For the People's History of Horror podcast. That's where we are right now.
That's us.
I've developed a reading list which I put together specifically to be my idea of the best way in which to approach King's work and King's fiction and really experience his world and his multiverse in the best way, I think, to experience such a read-through. We covered that on the first episode. To analyze the man's work, one has to do a lot of reading, and I think that these 3 works, It, The Stand, and the Dark Tower series, are really the linchpins, the tower at the center of the beam, if you will, of his entire career's work, perhaps with a bit of Salem's Lot and The Shining sprinkled in. These 5 titles, especially those first 3 in particular, make up a massive portion of the potentially unlimited creative capacity that King holds in his head. If we're going to do this kind of deep dive into horror, starting with King, as we are doing, then I just want to make this clear from the beginning here. We're going deep into a gigantic stack of books with deep lore and complex layered characters and storylines. This fact deserves some attention.
A gigantic stack of gigantic books.
Yeah. And I mean, we've covered, It is the book that really got me sucked into this world, followed closely by Pet Sematary, and then just a rush through as many as I could get through. And so it is interesting that one of the ones that actually took me a while to get into was The Stand, as far as my initial breeze through the entire synopsis. That was one of the later ones before I started having to read the ones that were currently coming out, you know.
I get that. I didn't have that problem. I loved it right away, but I did because my mother loved The Stand, so we every time it was on TV, we watched it, and I knew the story. My mom read it to us at one point, so I already knew the story, and I was excited to read it again. I already loved the characters in it.
And I mean, I did love it when I did read it, but it was just one that just took me longer to get around to. I guess because it was the first one, and that's a huge book.
It's a lot.
And Insomnia was another one of the, because it is based in Derry, it was like one of the fourth or fifth ones I read, just because it's like, there's another Derry novel, I'm definitely going to read that one, you know.
Maybe I'll see Pennywise again.
So several of the earlier books that I read, Desperation was another one of the early ones I read. I read a lot of the big ones first, and so when The Stand sitting there as another big one, I'm like, I'm going to read some of these shorter ones.
I get it.
And by then I was like lost into the Dark Tower series, so those books kind of held priority, you know, station for me as far as the next king I wanted to read. Till I will say, when I did get past the fourth book, I was like, I'm going to take a break from the Dark Tower and start, because that is when certain connections and shit start coming up.
Yeah.
And
that's when you want to expand your knowledge of the universe.
Yeah, like you definitely want to go back and,
because you're catching some things, but you know you're not catching everything, and that drives the shit out of you. Like, you gotta go back and read other things, that way you can see them all. And you might be reading something that's not connected at all, not even know it, but you know what? If you're enjoying it, you're enjoying it.
Yeah, because I mean, I don't want to get too close to a bunch of spoilers here, but when a certain character shows up on the page, like, the writer, especially one as talented as King, is able to give that character a certain gravitas where even if you don't know who this character is, you can immediately be like, this person is for some reason important. And yeah, like when someone like that just shows up on the page in the middle of a story that you think you're familiar with, you're like, who is this person? Why does this person seem like something, you know, that I should know about? And that's when you...
I'm assuming you're thinking of the same character I am.
Yeah.
But he writes them in a way where when he comes up on the page in any of the stories that he's in, then it's almost like you get the same feeling hits, almost as if he had a theme song. Like, you know, you just, oh man, I know this is.
And all of a sudden, Don't Fear the Reaper starts playing on the radio, and you're
exactly.
like, all right.
Yeah, like, oh, this guy, great.
I'm going to read a little bit more from this. This will definitely get your attention. Quote, "It is nothing more or less than King's ultimate thesis on horror, while his non-fiction book, Danse Macabre, is his thesis on the horror genre. One might think there is no difference, but there is. Horror is an emotion, a reaction to something. The horror genre is about capturing this reaction and throwing it into someone's mind, capturing that emotion in fiction and sometimes dissecting it for the pleasure of the reader. Dissecting a genre of fiction and using that very genre of fiction effectively is already a mighty task, and having the knowledge to understand the dissection before making the first cut is very lucky for King. This is, perhaps, why both the fiction and the non-fiction work so well, and tells us so much. King describes our relationship with horror as a dance. This is how he understands it." And here's a long quote. Quote, "If there is any truth or worth to the Danse Macabre, it is simply that novels, movies, TV, and radio programs, even the comic books dealing with horror, always do their work on two levels. On top is the gross-out level, when Reagan vomits in the priest's face or masturbates with a crucifix in The Exorcist, or when the raw-looking, terrible inside-out monster in John Frankenheimer's Prophecy crunches off the helicopter pilot's head like a Tootsie Pop. The gross-out can be done with varying degrees of artistic finesse, but it's always there. But on another, more potent level, the work of horror really is a dance, a moving rhythmic search. And what it's looking for is the place where you, the viewer or the reader, live at your most primitive level. The work of horror is not interested in the civilized furniture of our lives. Such a work dances through these rooms we have fitted out one piece at a time, each expressing, we hope, our socially acceptable, pleasantly enlightened character. It is in search of another place, a room which may sometimes resemble the secret den of a Victorian gentleman, sometimes the torture chamber of the Spanish Inquisition, but perhaps most frequently and most successfully the simple and brutally plain hole of a Stone Age cave dweller. Is horror art? On the second level, the work of horror can be nothing else. It achieves the level of art simply because it's looking for something beyond art, something that predates art. It is looking for what I would call phobic pressure points. The good horror tale will dance its way to the center of your life and find secret door to the room you believed nobody but you knew of, as both Albert Camus and Billy Joel have pointed out. The stranger makes us nervous, but we love to try on his face in secret. Do spiders give you the horror? Fine, we'll have spiders, as in Tarantula, The Incredible Shrinking Man, and The Kingdom of the Spiders. What about rats? In James Herbert's novel of the same name, you can feel them crawl all over you and eat you alive. How about snakes? That shut-in feeling, heights, or whatever is there. Because books and movies are mass media, the field of horror has often been able to better than even these personal fears over the last 30 years. I got something about that wrong, but we'll just move on. During the period, and to a lesser degree in the 70 or so years preceding, the horror genre has often been able to find national phobic pressure points, and those books and films which have been the most successful almost always seem to play up and express fears which exist across a wide spectrum of people. Such fears, which are often political, economic, and psychological rather than supernatural, give the best work of horror a pleasing allegorical feel, and it's a sort of allegory that most filmmakers seem at home with, maybe because they know if the shit starts getting too thick, they can always bring the monster shambling out of the darkness again. This is the real Danse Macabre, I suspect. Those remarkable moments when the creator of a horror story is able to unite the conscious and subconscious mind with one potent idea. It makes sense then, this is me again.
Man gave a thesis as a quote.
It makes sense then that this ultimate tale of horror has a villain that can take any shape and is the embodiment of horror itself. And this thing has a favorite shape, that of Pennywise the dancing clown. And so
does a stupid little dance.
Well, I'm just saying that's an interesting piece of King's psychology, that he views horror as a dance, and that he just happens
His
to...
most horrifying creature is a dancing clown, yeah.
And so what do you, Mike, think of the idea of The Stand, It, and The Dark Tower kind of being the center of King's world with all these other stories kind of circling them?
I mean, I definitely agree. That's what everything... that they're the stories that really connect the universe. Granted, you know, several other smaller stories are the little smaller threads that help to enrich in it. But no, that's really the glue that holds it all together. Granted, I do agree with the other two, The Shining and Salem's Lot, as really fleshing it out. Those are pillars or towers, if you will, beams.
Well, the reason that I kind of made that separation is whereas all five, obviously the Dark Tower being the main one, kind of give you a baseline of mythology and everything. That's really all The Shining and Salem's Lot does, is where they introduce you to a theme or a piece. Whereas with something like It or The Stand, it
doesn't progress the universe in any way. It just, hey, here's how this works.
Yeah, whereas with The Stand and It, they kind of tell a bigger piece of the story, not just because they're longer novels, but they cover more ground as far as...
They're more action.
Well,
it's hard to say that with Salem's Lot. But
well, it's just they also tend to delve deeper in the mythos of certain villains, of course, with Randall Flagg and Pennywise, but also the ideas behind something like Pennywise and the evil town, and the fact that later on other things happen in, for example, Derry, that also progress things, and those things wouldn't have happened or wouldn't have happened in the same way without it happening first.
Yeah.
And The Stand acts in much the same way, especially more closely to something like, the Dark Tower series. One book that I would also include in the same kind of category as The Shining and Salem's Lot would be Insomnia. But the only reason that I don't really include it is because it's even more microcosm where a lot of the mythos and universe expanding things that you get in Insomnia were kind of already there, and it's more of just a y'all remember that this is a thing kind of callback, as opposed to
it's a recap.
Yeah. And so I would include Insomnia in there also because it is as good as those, and I would put it in the same level as far as interesting. But when it comes to actual world building and mythos making,
it's a different story.
It's just
interesting here.
Yeah. And so as far as The Stand and It and The Dark Tower go, they also just, those 10 books by themselves make up just a huge portion of his bibliography as it is as far as page count goes. Especially if you start including The Shining and Insomnia and, Salem's Lot, then, yeah. And so the reason I bring that up specifically is that there's the idea that King has lost his touch or whatever. That really kind of started pretty early on in his career, and ridiculously early, like in the 90s, before some of his better books were even written, before the ending of The Dark Tower even. Like, people were already writing him off as if, he'd already written all of his great books. And I really think the reason is because we haven't really got another author that just kept pumping out banger after banger after banger. And so, like, if someone else had written The Shining, The Stand, and Salem's Lot all in one, go like that.
The only other authors I can think of that I hear people throw out there on that level, because they're pumping out multiple books, they're not pumping out multiple different books, they're pumping out multiple books in a series.
And even then, like, they're not really, because, you gotta remember for like 25, 30 straight years, you were getting 2 or 3 King novels a year.
Yeah, no one's pumping out numbers
I don't see anyone doing anything.
And no one's putting out, no one's as consistent numbers-wise, or...
you could say James Patterson, but I don't believe you want me to get started on that.
He's not a real author.
So that was your first taste, our new segment on the People's History of Horror podcast. And what do you want to call it?
We'll just call it Blunt Talk. That was kind of a callback to a few years ago when we were thinking about first doing a podcast, a conversation for the name. Then that was thrown out there quite a bit. So yeah, we're smoking a blunt and talking about random stuff. So
yeah, I figure we just have this more chill, relaxed, laid back kind of thing where we just cover some of the blog stuff and just kind of go over stuff that we didn't really get either delved into deep enough in our regular series, or just doesn't really go along with the theme of that episode, and we'll just kind of throw some of these up occasionally.
And I'm going to be honest with you guys, we're really doing this because we have a habit of kind of going off on tangents and going off on the deep end, and we'll have a lot to talk about, and we can't do that. We can't give you guys a 5-hour podcast, sorry. So that's what it would be. So this is going to help us to, not be boring.
And this is basically kind of like a behind the scenes, more of a, we know that these are our first podcasts and we're not super great at this, and we got to get used to just shooting the shit on the mic, and this is one way to get better. It's a less structured, more just
practice makes perfect.
Just freewheeling, like we got to have something to say, so let's figure out something to say kind of things. And obviously, like I just said, we'll get better at this as well, and our other episodes will be even better. And that's kind of what we want to work on, is just getting better at this for y'all so we can be, better hosts.
And I mean, the conversations we have after the podcast, after we're done shooting a podcast, when we're just hanging out, like, they're pretty interesting usually. So a lot of these are going to be pretty much those. It's going to be, the highlights of our random conversations that are had because of the content that we're doing.
And we just get going. We have to kind of rein ourselves in because, like you said, if we gave you a 5-hour episode for every part of every book that we read, we'd never get through
We'd
any
have
of these.
2 viewers and our mothers.
Yeah. And so, that being the case, we would like you to, we're about to spit off some social media and stuff to you here in a second, and so please get on those things and give us your tips. If there's something wrong with the audio, let us know. If there's, specific things that y'all know better than we do and we left it out, and let us know and we'll mention it in the next show.
Absolutely. Any feedback, anything we can work on, we're happy to hear it.
And so thank you for joining us here at the People's History of Horror podcast. Please go and join our Patreon at Strange Creation Co. and get on our Discord at the same place.
Find us on Facebook. We have a Facebook page. YouTube, obviously.
That's probably where you're listening right now.
If you haven't done it yet, then like and subscribe, please.
And we're going to shortly be on all the other places. And also, don't forget to check out my blog at the Strange Creation Literary Blog.
And we would also appreciate it if you would share this. Share this around. Share it on YouTube. Share it to your friends. Share it in Discord.
TikTok, Twitter, all those things. It's not even Twitter now, but whatever. Last thing, shout outs to the great Laura Farrell for all of our media work and sound.
She's amazing.
Signing off.